A few years back, I found myself hitchhiking through the Midwest. My funds were low, and my old car had broken down a couple of states ago. Hitchhiking wasn't new to me. It wasn't glamorous, but it got me where I needed to go. Most of the people who stopped for me were kind or, at worst, indifferent. I'd never encountered any real trouble, until one night when I got into the wrong car. It was late October, and darkness had fallen hours earlier. Somewhere in Kansas, I was trudging along a lonely highway, sticking out my thumb whenever a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. The crisp night air bit at my skin, and the road was deserted except for the occasional truck rumbling past. My boots scuffed against the gravel as I walked, trying to stay warm. After what felt like miles of walking, a car finally appeared. I stepped off the shoulder, extending my thumb, hoping this one would stop. To my relief, the car slowed and pulled over a short distance ahead. It was an old sedan with peeling paint and an engine that sputtered noisily as it idled. Jogging up to the passenger side, I saw the window was rolled halfway down. The driver leaned over to look at me, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, with greasy hair and hollow eyes. He wore a worn-out flannel shirt, and a cigarette dangled from his lips. "Need a ride?" he asked in a raspy voice. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, trying not to sound too desperate. I hesitated briefly, but exhaustion and the cold won out. I opened the door and slid into the seat, placing my backpack at my feet. The interior smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat. "Where you headed?" he asked, merging back onto the road. "Just trying to get to the next town," I said. "Anywhere with a gas station or diner would be fine." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road. The silence between us felt thick, but I was too tired to make conversation. I stared out the window, watching the dark fields blur past. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "You hitchhike often?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not really by choice, though." He let out a low chuckle, void of humor. "Gotta be careful out here. Not everyone's friendly." "Yeah, I know," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles white. The cigarette in his mouth had burned to the filter, but he didn't seem to notice. The silence stretched again, growing more oppressive with every mile. I tried to brush off my unease, convincing myself it was nothing. But then I realized something odd. He hadn't asked where I'd come from or where I was headed. Most drivers made small talk, at least out of curiosity, but he seemed uninterested in who I was. That lack of interest unsettled me. Then, without warning, he turned onto a narrow dirt road. Where are we going?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Shortcut," he said without looking at me. I stared ahead. It wasn't a shortcut, it was barely a road, just a faint path cutting through empty fields. There were no signs, no lights, nothing to indicate it led anywhere. My pulse quickened. "I thought we were heading to the next town," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We are," he replied. "Relax." Every instinct screamed at me that something was wrong. My pocketknife was in my backpack, but it was out of reach without drawing attention. My heart pounded as I scrambled for an escape. "Actually, I think I'll just walk from here," I said, reaching for the door handle. The car slowed but didn't stop. He turned to me, his face dimly lit by the dashboard. His expression was cold, almost predatory. "It's not safe out here," he said. "You shouldn't be walking alone." "I'll take my chances," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for the ride, though." For a moment, he didn't move, his grip tightening on the wheel. Then, without warning, he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, throwing me forward against the seatbelt. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't hesitate. Fumbling with the handle, I grabbed my backpack and stumbled out. The car sped off as soon as I was clear, its taillights vanishing into the darkness. Shaking, I stood alone on the pitch-black road. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind. I had no idea where I was or how far I'd have to walk to find safety. Hours later, I stumbled into a gas station, my feet blistered and my nerves frayed. When I told the clerk about the driver, his expression darkened. "You're lucky," he said. "There've been stories about a guy like that, picks people up and takes them to the middle of nowhere. Not all of them make it back." I didn't stay to ask questions. I called a friend to come get me and vowed never to hitchhike again. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I'll never forget the chill in his eyes when he told me to relax. This happened a few years ago during a late-night drive back home after visiting my parents. It was close to midnight, and I was traveling along a stretch of highway that cut through miles of farmland. The road was empty, with only the occasional pair of headlights passing by in the opposite lane. The stillness of the night made my thoughts louder, and I started regretting my decision to leave so late. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something ahead on the shoulder, a figure walking, briefly illuminated by my headlights as I approached. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a worn jacket and jeans. His thumb was out, the universal sign for hitchhiking. I'm not the type to pick up hitchhikers. Too many cautionary tales and unsettling movies have cemented that rule for me. But something about this man made me pause. Maybe it was the isolation of the highway or the thought of leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. He jogged up to the car, his face partially obscured in the dim light. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice calm but subdued. "I just need a ride to the next town." I hesitated but unlocked the door. "Hop in," I said, trying to sound casual. He slid into the passenger seat, placing a small backpack on his lap. Up close, I could see the exhaustion on his face. His pale complexion and dark circles under his eyes stood out in the faint glow of the dashboard. "Thanks," he said again as I pulled back onto the highway. "Not a problem," I replied, though I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the engine. Hoping to ease the tension, I turned on the radio. He said little, staring out the window and clutching the straps of his backpack. I tried to break the awkwardness. "So, where are you headed?" "Just the next town," he said without turning to look at me. "You from around here?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, just passing through." His curt, vague answers did nothing to ease my nerves. I focused on the road, but the tension between us felt palpable, growing heavier with each passing mile. Something about him seemed off. I couldn't pinpoint why, but the unease gnawed at me. After several minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "You ever think about how dangerous it is to pick up a stranger?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed nervously, tightening my grip on the wheel. "I guess so," I said. "But you looked like you needed help." He turned to me then, his gaze sharp and unnerving. "A lot of bad people out there," he said slowly. "You never know who you're letting into your car." I swallowed hard, forcing another nervous laugh. "I like to think most people are good," I said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't respond. He just turned back to the window, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was unbearable. My mind raced with unsettling scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. I kept sneaking glances at him, trying to figure out his intentions. He continued gripping his backpack tightly. Was he nervous, or was he waiting? Relief washed over me when I saw a sign for a gas station up ahead. "I'll drop you off here," I said, unable to hide the eagerness in my voice. At first, he didn't respond. Then, after a pause, he nodded. "All right." I pulled into the gas station lot, stopping near the pumps. The place was almost deserted, save for a single pickup truck parked by the convenience store. "Good luck," I said, forcing a smile. He opened the door and stepped out, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Before closing the door, he leaned down and looked directly at me. His face was blank, but his eyes were cold. "Be careful who you stop for," he said. Then he shut the door and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. Something about his final words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait to see what he did next. I pulled out of the lot and drove back onto the highway, my heart pounding all the way home. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Out of curiosity and unease, I searched online, typing in the name of the highway and hitchhiker. What I found made my blood run cold. Just weeks earlier, a man had been found dead in his car along that same stretch of road. Foul play was suspected, and witnesses reported seeing a hitchhiker matching the description of the man I'd picked up. A few years ago, I took a road trip to visit my sister, who lived about 500 miles away. I'd recently bought a new car, and I figured the drive would be the perfect way to break it in. My plan was to split the trip into 2 days, stopping overnight at a budget motel along the way. Most of the drive was on highways, but there was a stretch of remote backroads I needed to take to cut through a less traveled area. On the second day of my trip, I found myself cruising along one of those long, desolate stretches of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another vehicle. The sun was setting, bathing the fields and woods in a golden-orange glow. It was serene, almost hypnotic, and I didn't mind the solitude. As dusk approached, I spotted someone walking along the edge of the road. A man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. He carried a backpack slung over one shoulder and had his thumb out. Normally, I wouldn't even consider stopping for a hitchhiker, too many horror stories and risks, but something about him seemed different. He looked more like someone down on his luck than a potential threat. With nightfall coming fast, I thought about how I'd feel in his position and decided to stop. I rolled down the window and called out, "Need a ride?" He nodded, his voice hoarse but steady. "Yeah, if it's not too much trouble. Just heading up the road." "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. He climbed into the passenger seat, placing his backpack on the floor between his feet. Up close, he looked exhausted, his face pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He gave me a faint, grateful smile. "Thanks," he said. "Not many people stop these days." "Yeah, well," I replied, trying to sound casual, "guess I'm feeling generous." For a while, we drove in silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the faint music from the radio. I stole a few glances at him, trying to read his demeanor. He sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his lap. There was something unnerving about his stillness, but I brushed it off. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "Nowhere specific," he said without turning his head. "Just trying to get away." "Get away from what?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "Just, away." His vague response didn't exactly ease my nerves, so I dropped the subject and focused on the road. The trees lining the road grew denser as the sunlight faded. The twilight gave everything an eerie, endless quality. After a few minutes, he spoke again. "You ever hear of the hitchhiker's curse?" I frowned, glancing at him. "The what?" "It's this old story," he said, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "They say if you pick up the wrong hitchhiker, you'll never make it to where you're going." I forced a nervous laugh, though unease crept up my spine. "That's comforting." "It's just a story," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "But it makes you think, doesn't it? How many people stop for someone they shouldn't?" I didn't know what to say to that. The tension in the car thickened, and the silence felt oppressive. I turned up the radio a notch, hoping to dispel the unease, but it didn't help. We drove for another 20 minutes, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My headlights illuminated only the stretch of road directly ahead, and every shadow seemed to shift unnervingly. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His hands were clenched tightly on his lap, his posture rigid. Where exactly should I drop you off?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Here is fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just pull over." Relieved, I slowed down and eased onto the shoulder. The area was deserted, just trees and the endless dark. He grabbed his backpack and opened the door but paused before stepping out. Turning to me, his expression blank, he said, "Thanks for the ride. Drive safe." I nodded quickly. "Yeah, no problem." He stepped out and closed the door, disappearing into the darkness. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he stood on the shoulder, staring after the car as I drove away. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I reassured myself it was over. A few miles later, though, the air in the car felt strange. It was colder, heavier, and carried a faint metallic scent, like blood. I glanced at the vents, thinking something might be wrong with the AC, but it was off. Then I checked the rearview mirror. He was sitting in the back seat. My heart stopped, and I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I whipped around, but the back seat was empty. Breathing heavily, I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down and make sense of what just happened. Finally, I put the car back in gear and drove straight to the nearest town. That night at the motel, I locked the door and barely slept, feeling like someone was watching me the entire time. The next morning, I searched online for anything about the hitchhiker's curse. Most of what I found was urban legend, phantom hitchhikers vanishing before reaching their destination. But one article stood out. It described reports of a man fitting the exact description of the hitchhiker I'd picked up, pale, tired-looking, wearing a flannel shirt. Multiple drivers on Route 42 had claimed to see him, and all said he vanished before they could drop him off. I've avoided that route ever since, and I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. For years, hitchhiking has been a necessity for me. It's not something I enjoy, but when money's tight and you need to get somewhere, you make do. Most of the time, it's uneventful, just a ride, a bit of small talk, and then you part ways. But one ride stands out, a chilling experience that made me question if I'd ever hitchhike again. It was late September, a cold night in the middle of nowhere. I'd been dropped off along a remote highway in Montana, far from any town. The sun had just set, and the air was growing colder by the minute. I only had a thin jacket and a backpack with my belongings, and after walking for nearly an hour without spotting a single car, I was starting to lose hope. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance. I stuck out my thumb, praying they'd stop. The car, a battered old station wagon, slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. I jogged to the passenger window, which the driver leaned over to roll down. The man behind the wheel was older, probably in his late 50s, with gray hair peeking out from under a baseball cap. His face was weathered, etched with lines that hinted at years spent on the road. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, if you're heading north," I replied. I tossed my backpack into the back seat and climbed in. The car smelled faintly of cigarettes and worn upholstery. The man didn't say much at first, keeping his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a tense energy. I tried to break the silence. "Thanks for stopping," I said. "Not many cars out tonight." He gave a short nod. "Not many people either." The comment struck me as strange, but I brushed it off as small talk. We drove for a while in near silence, the only sound the steady hum of the engine as the headlights cut through the darkness. "Where you headed?" he asked after some time, his eyes never leaving the road. "Spokane," I said. "Meeting a friend there." He nodded again, his face unreadable. "Long way to go." "Yeah, but I'll get there," I said with a forced laugh, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't respond. The quiet stretched on, and the air in the car grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, or how his eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few minutes, it put me on edge. "You do this often?" he asked suddenly. "Hitchhiking?" I said, startled. "Yeah, when I need to." He didn't reply right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. "Not everyone who picks you up is safe." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone cautious. He shrugged, his grip on the wheel tightening. "People disappear. Hitchhikers, drivers. Bad things happen out here." I forced a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, I try to be careful." He didn't laugh. His jaw tensed, and his gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. The atmosphere in the car felt colder, heavier. After a few minutes, he turned off the highway onto a narrow, unpaved road. My pulse quickened. Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Shortcut," he said curtly. I didn't believe him. The road was barely more than a dirt path, flanked by dense woods on either side. My hand hovered near the door handle, but I knew jumping out at this speed wasn't an option. "I think I'll just get out here," I said, trying to sound steady. "I can walk the rest of the way." He didn't respond. Instead, he gripped the wheel tighter and sped up. Panic surged through me as I considered my options. My backpack was in the back seat, and inside it was a small knife. But could I reach it without him noticing? Before I could act, he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, and he turned to face me. His expression was eerily calm, but his eyes were dark and unreadable. "Get out," he said, his voice low and steady. "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "You heard me," he said, his tone unwavering. "Get out of the car." I didn't argue. I grabbed my backpack and scrambled out onto the dirt road. The moment I was clear, he hit the gas and sped off, his taillights vanishing into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know where I was or how far it was to the nearest town. Then, in the direction the car had gone, I saw something. A faint light flickered in the distance, like the glow of a fire. As I squinted, I realized there were figures moving around it. Shadows danced in the firelight, but something about the way they moved wasn't right. My stomach churned as dread settled over me. I didn't want to know what was happening down there. I turned and started walking back toward the highway, my heart pounding with every step. I didn't look back. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I'd stayed in that car, or what I would have found at that fire.